Hello again to everybody, welcome back. Dr. JC here, World History 2, World War II, Part 2. Three deuces, how do you like them apples? And guess what? 2 weeks to go. Four deuces. Bam! And no, I'm not going to say, and two atomic bombs, five deuces. All right, enough of that. I got it. Yes, I'm getting punchy tired like the rest of you guys. It is week 15. Stay alert, stay alive. We're going to pick up in this part of lecture 1415 specifically for week 15 or lecture 15 with the end of World War II, the drive to Berlin, so to speak, and ending the war in Europe, the realization by the Allies that this unthinkable madness that was the final solution or Holocaust had occurred. And we'll spend a little bit of time too closing the war out in Asia and weighing the variables that went into U.S. decision making to use atomic weaponry, to include a little of the present historical discussion and debate as it relates to that. So let's jump right into part 2 here, and we'll pick up in Europe. When last we left in part 1, the Allies had successfully invaded Western Europe. France had broken Rommel's Festung Europa, or Fortress Europe, the Atlantic Wall. And once that toehold on the continent was firmly in place, Allied arms, men, material will pour in to pressure the Germans from the west. At the same time, the Germans are being pressured from the south through the Italian peninsula. At the same time, they're being heavily pressured from the east by the Russians. Thus, with this successful Operation Overlord or D-Day, the discussion really largely turns to when, not if, the Allies are going to win. And while the Germans will, during the winter of 44 and 45, launch a last-ditch all-out effort in much the same ground and in much the same way as that spring offensive in World War I, the Kaiserschlacht, known here in World War II as the Battle of the Ardennes Forest or the Battle of the Bulge, because of the way the Allied line will bend back on itself, but will not break. And once that German attack stalls here, just like it did in World War I, the writing will truly be on the wall. And in February of 1945, as Allied troops drive from all points of the compass seemingly toward the heart of Germany, the Allies' leaders will meet. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin will meet for 7 days in Yalta in the Crimea. And it was here that Churchill and FDR began to push many of the principles that had been spelled out in this Atlantic Charter in August of 1941, but Joseph Stalin largely wasn't having any of it. The only thing Stalin was interested in was all of Eastern Europe. And while a series of so-styled accords will be agreed to, whether or not they're adhered to is another story. And while Churchill may well have wanted to push for Operation Unthinkable, you guys can look it up, as a way to deal with Russia, Stalin, communism, while the British and Americans have innumerable divisions in the field in Germany already. Looking at the image on the slide here at Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this is anything but a well man. And thus the best that Churchill and FDR could achieve was the promise by Stalin of free democratic elections, especially in Poland. And as you may well imagine and guess, Stalin is not going to live up to that word. And that will lead us into this Cold War, which we'll discuss next week in week 16. And thus, after Yalta breaks up, the Allies continue to squeeze Germany. Mussolini had already been rooted out by his people, shot and hung upside down from an Exxon station, like some damn deer during hunting season. So for any of you who want to be dictator out there, that might be the result. Proceed with caution. For Herr Hitler, it was a cyanide capsule. Either way, both of these cats are toast. The Allies are in Berlin, and on May 7th in Reims, north and east of Paris, German General Staff will meet at Eisenhower's headquarters there, sign an official capitulation. The Russians will not recognize that because they were not present. Eisenhower then will rush the German General Staff to Berlin, and on May 8th, with the Russians present, the official capitulation will be signed, and VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, will be forever remembered. And before we transition to closing out the war in the Pacific, there are two other events that will be remembered. One in Europe and one back in the United States. We'll start in the United States. When FDR returned home from Yalta, remember, he says, shown in this picture again, he's not a well man. When he returns back home to the United States, he's looking to do a little R&R. He heads to Warm Springs in Georgia. These mineral springs for the longest period of time had thought to have been pools of wellness, so to speak, and he'll head there to Georgia. And on the 12th of April, 1945, he's going to pass away. With FDR's passing, presidential succession kicks in, and Harry Truman's the new president of the United States. And it will be Harry Truman then that gets to experience Victory in Europe Day, and also try to figure out how to deal with Germans who were responsible for this final solution. Now, I'm not going to go into the Holocaust here, not because I'm chicken and because it's too dark, but because there's no way I can do it justice. I'm going to ask that everybody out there go ahead and spend a little bit of time to look up what this final solution was all about. But I will say this as it relates to Germans and those that seem to want to today continue to go after individuals who may have been part of the system, pulling 90-year-old guys out of Cleveland, Ohio, and dragging them back to frickin' Germany. I don't know what it was like to have to serve. I don't know what it was like to have to perhaps have been a guard in a German uniform. Someone perhaps to have to carry out this type of, I don't even have a word for it, madness. But if somebody held a gun to my head and threatened me or threatened my kids, I don't know what decision I would make, okay? I would like to think I'm a better man and say, shoot me. I don't know I can do that. And therefore, I am damn sure not going to be anyone to condemn someone else for doing what was, well, their duty. And if you want to go after anything, go after the very root of what was causing all this to begin with, allowing a totalitarian to come to power. That's the lesson for all of us, because that's where the dark garbage comes from. The darker angels of our nature emerge. It's when good people remain silent. That's the lesson. And I will say this in defense of the German people. And it's captured somewhat in the movie The Band of Brothers. I give them credit for cutting in this little piece. For anybody that hasn't seen it, I recommend that you do. There's a scene in the series where members of the 101st Airborne that are depicted here in the series, they come out of experiencing one of these camps and they wander into this bombed out town, and there are 3 Germans sitting about playing stringed instruments, and they're playing Beethoven. So the same German people that can be responsible for the madness that was the Holocaust are the same people that can give us timeless music that I listen to daily and appreciate. And that's all I'm saying on this. Are we any better? Again, that's all I'm saying on this. Now, once victory was secured in Europe, the focus shifts specifically to Asia. And for the United States, it wasn't just a matter of defeating Japan. It was also, what type of message are we going to try to perhaps send to the Russians? And what might we do to help the nationalists in China as well? So while the United States was looking to end World War II formally with the Japanese, take them out, they also had an eye to the future, which is, what are we going to do about communism, whether it be in the Stalin version or the Mao version in Russia or China. Now, as it relates to the actual fighting in the Pacific or Pacific Theater, as previously mentioned, the war really did already start to turn in the summer of 1942, really roughly about 8, 9, 10 months after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are going to suffer setbacks at the Battle of Coral Sea and most especially at the Battle of Midway. And from that point on, akin to the D-Day invasion of Europe, where it marked the when rather than the if Germany's going to lose. By the summer of 42, it was a matter of when, not if, Japan was going to lose. There's no way they could keep up with the American productive capabilities, and the longer they continue to fight Americans in the Pacific, at the same time they're still fighting the Chinese, it's fast becoming a mathematical equation. Following these successes at Coral Sea, and most specifically Midway, U.S. war planners began to formulate what was known as a leapfrogging or island hopping strategy. They'd implement this in 1943 and carry it through to the end of the war. The whole goal here was to keep the eye on the prize, and the eye on the prize was the mainland island of Japan. How do we get there most expeditiously with the least loss of life and property? And it was determined that the best way to bring an end to the war with Japan was to get within range air bases to where U.S. aircraft could begin to bomb the island into submission. Thus, as depicted on this slide, the whole goal was to bypass certain islands. It's one of Sun Tzu's principles: avoid what is strong, attack what is weak. If I can bypass a stronghold island and capture islands closer to Japan, I can, for all intents and purposes, seal off any supplies coming into those strongholds and basically turn this into a siege. Those military assets on those islands are useless if they can't be resupplied. So we're just going to go around them rather than through them. Now, there will be some U.S. military commanders, like General MacArthur here, that moves beyond the plan, and this won't be the first time that MacArthur looks to do things beyond what he's being directed to do. We'll get to that in week 16 as well with the Korean conflict. But by and large, it was a very successful strategy. Now, this is not to imply that the islands that were chosen to hop to were easily taken. That's not the case. A great example of that is the Battle of Iwo Jima. But it did allow the United States to pick up key pieces of geography, islands, to which they could build out air bases with their Seabees and combat engineers, and then begin to launch long-range bombers to hit cities within the mainland of Japan itself. Now, before talking briefly about the bombing campaign of the island of Japan, which is going to include a discussion about the use of atomic weaponry, it's important to have a quick discussion about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Leyte Gulf, and Okinawa, not depicted here because of its impact on the Japanese civilian population especially. And it's important to have this discussion because it is going to be one of the variables that weighs into this larger calculus as to whether or not President Truman is going to use atomic weaponry on Japan to get them to tap out. The battles of Leyte Gulf, October of 44, Iwo Jima, February of 45, and Okinawa, April of 46, shown here on the map, and a good visual of this island hopping strategy to gain assets closer to the mainland of Japan. Each gave the United States evidence of the will of the Japanese to fight, and perhaps to fight to the last. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was actually a series of battles fought in October 44. The United States will first witness the use of what the Japanese referred to as the divine wind, or kamikaze. Japanese kamikaze pilots were military aviators, part of this larger special attack unit created by the Japanese. Its sole purpose was to load Japanese military aircraft with all sorts of ordnance and explosive, and have the military aviator fly that plane right into the side of his ship. These are suicide bombers. And if it's the will of the emperor, if it's the will of the living god Hirohito, you do it. At Iwo Jima in February of 45, a 5-week battle or slugfest took place here, and while American casualties were very high, some 25,000 or nearly 25% of those engaged, Japanese losses were nearly the same, with very few taken prisoner, meaning those that fought to the last. And at Okinawa in April of 1945, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. What's most distressing here is the civilian population. Over half of the civilian population will cease to exist on the island, a good many of them committing suicide. You may have seen the film footage, women taking their children to the cliffs, throwing their children off the cliffs and jumping after them. Can't even imagine what they were told Americans would do to them to make them take that leap. Collectively, the weight of these things helped Truman recognize if we go to invade the island of Japan, yes, it will cost us many American lives, but what will it cost the Japanese? Now, there's much debate today over whether or not atomic force was necessary. All that's armchair quarterbacking. The reality is, the The U.S. did make use of atomic weaponry at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and don't think for a minute it wasn't to send a message to the Russians as well. And as a result of that, it's going to get the Japanese to tap out. And in September of 1945, on the Mighty Mo, the USS Missouri, the Japanese will formally capitulate, ending World War II, not just in the Pacific, but overall.